So in a world where at McDonald's anything extra is free, or at Starbucks a cup of water is free, there's a reason why we can access Facebook or Google at really no cost at all to us. And the reason for that is that we're actually the product. And what I mean is that our data is always being taken and compiled and analyzed and sold to sell advertising to us. And unfortunately, that data is not always well protected. So today, what I'm going to be discussing is, the corporate inability or even disinterest in protecting our data, and then discuss the kind of protections that the United States government has for us and how that compares to the European Union's. And in doing so, I hope to demonstrate the need for the United States federal government to adopt data protection regulations similar to that of the European Union's. So now that we know what we're doing today, let's move right into why there's a need for this kind of policy, and that's corporate failure to protect our data. And the first example is that of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, a consulting firm. And if you haven't heard about it, this occurred about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, around the time of the last election. And what actually happened was Cambridge Analytica created this Facebook personality quiz app. I'm sure we've taken one in the day. And it took advantage of a Facebook policy in which they shared data with academic researchers. They essentially lied and took all that data, and they used it to construct political profiles for Donald Trump's election. And according to Bubar, the New York Times, the kind of information they got was actually very granular. They got information such as a list of likes, they got what groups we were in, and they even trawled through some individuals' private messages. And you might be thinking at this point, okay, well, I don't play those silly quizzes anymore. This doesn't really affect me. Well, you're actually wrong, because according to Steinmeier, the business source Elite, originally only 305,000 participants were affected, but CA actually elected to scrape the profiles of all their friends. So that number jumped up to 87 million. And so what we can see from this example is that even if you take steps to not take part in these applications, you can be affected. And not only that, but we have no way as consumers to know if every single individual firm that we get services from has the kind of protection that we need. We can't really read through all of those terms of services. It's basically impossible. And at this point, the FTC is still trying to sue them, but fines are very rare for situations like this, and it's very unlikely that anything will change. And even more recently, if you have a credit card, you might be concerned. Equifax in 2017 had another similar cybersecurity breach. And the United States House of Representatives Oversight Committee actually stated that in this breach, 140 million consumers were affected. And that's, to put into scale, that's like about half the United States, a little less. And what's alarming is that, similar to the situation in CA, you can't really opt out. So these credit reporting agencies scrape our data from financial service industries, profiles, and data stores, and we can't really opt out. And so the kind of information that was lost was a little more serious than Facebook likes. It was stuff like addresses, social security numbers, credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, information that could seriously be used to constitute identity fraud or result in really material financial harm to us consumers. And the Oversight Committee actually stated that this breach was entirely preventable. They had known months prior that there was a software issue, and unfortunately there was a disconnect in the IT structure so that what they knew and what had to be done, was not completed. And a couple months later, this kind of thing occurred. And the Oversight Committee also stated that had they not put these complex IT structures on really old operating systems, because they were so aggressively pursuing more data, we need more consumer, we need more data points, this could have been prevented. To make it even worse, once it happened, Equifax did not disclose this to anybody for 6 weeks, and in that time, some of their managers even sold off their shares. And since then, there's been no consequence, no fine, no change in any kind of law, and their stock has mostly rebounded. So we can see that there's nothing we can do. We can't contest industries with billions of dollars, or if not hundreds of billions of dollars, and so we need some kind of protection from the government. And so I'll move on to the difference between what we have here in the United States and that of the European Union's. So let's just start with the United States. There is actually no established federal agency that's in charge of protecting our data. There is certainly case-by-case policies that are created, like HIPAA for the health industry or the financial services industry. Sometimes that will happen, but they're often contradictory and do not cover all Americans, really. And I'm sure you've heard of California's attempts to kind of push a data privacy law. It's very patchwork that we have right now. It's municipal and state laws, and as you would imagine, because it's a patchwork, it's like a sieve, a lot of pieces come through. It's hard for some areas to have the proper jurisdiction or to have proper enforcement, and it's just generally not effective at all. And so there is the fact that the Federal Trade Commission kind of can sue people and individuals, and it's kind of considered itself the big dog. But the fact is that, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, there's actually a legal battle in the district courts right now as to whether or not the FTC even has that authority. And according to the same group, even if they had that authority, they lack jurisdiction over certain big players such as banks, even certain internet service providers, nonprofits. And so these are kind of groups that you might want some kind of oversight in, right? So as you can see, again, in the United States, there's no way to legally intervene during the process, during like Equifax's process. They can only, kind of like firefighters, see the event afterwards and try to put the fire out and not really protect us in a more meaningful way. So how does that compare to the European Union's? Well, they have actually implemented in the last year the General Protection Data Regulation, GDPR, and it's much more effective. So the first part of it is that we as consumers must be asked to opt in before Facebook, for example, uses our data. It can't be hidden in terms of service, and they must clearly explain to us what the data is being used for. They can actually have a structure for fining these companies. They can be fined up to 20 million euros. They could be fined up to 4% of their global turnover. And they also have those preventative measures that we kind of really need as Americans. So for example, if the firm in question systemically deals with data day to day, then they must have a data protection officer, which is essentially a liaison between regulators and between the firm to make sure that things are really occurring as it should. And unlike that experience in Equifax and the European Union under the GDPR, if there's a breach, it must be disclosed within 3 calendar days. And the last part of it, which is actually pretty nice, is we also have a little option that we don't in the United States, is in Europe or in any European Union's country, you can request to a firm like, oh, what data do you have about me? What do you have like on file? And they have to explain to you in detail within 1 month what they have. So we can obviously see that there's a stringent difference between their policies and ours, and that there's a need for the United States federal government to really adopt that difference. And some individuals might rebut and say, oh, well, like, what about corporations that are interested in, keeping up their bottom line? They don't want to experience like public outcry. But as we see, it's not really the case. Like, since Facebook's scandal, this last financial quarter, if you've been paying attention, they've had record numbers, record users, and record revenue. So it's not really an actual thing that materializes. And in addition to that, the only alternative is what we have now. There's no system. Individual communities are trying to do their best, and it's just not effective. So I think today, just to summarize and bring everything together, we've seen that there's an obvious need for our data to be protected. We've seen that corporations are not interested in protecting our data. And we've also seen that the United States has no federal system to protect their data. So it's very obvious that we need a change. I think the European Union's articles are a very good place to start, and it's something that we should all consider. And as usual with my speeches, I like to think that it's very relevant water cooler talk, but more than that, you should care, because this stuff, there's really nothing you can do to protect yourself. So it honestly can lead to some financial harm, and you should be concerned. So hopefully you learned something today, and thank you for listening.
Such a pitiful applause of 5 people.
It was 8:50.
Yeah, I got 8:41.
That was a mouthful, Jesus.
I'm gonna have to do the same thing, talking kind of fast as you through it all.
Get through it all. I don't want to run 10 minutes long. I want to do it for you guys.
Yeah, thanks. I want to make sure we have time. I appreciate that. I have some stories in mind. I need those dramatic pauses. 10, 20
You rush through the rest of it.
Exactly.
So Adrian's not here. Cadence is doing the written evaluation, so I'll just do the oral evaluation quickly. I like the analogy that you have at the beginning of the speech to get our attention. You've got a very clear statement of what your topic is. The goal is explicit, and there's a solid preview. I like the example that you used of Cambridge Analytics and explaining how that developed information, and I could use a little bit more information about how they ended up getting access to the friends list of all the people that were engaged in the one access point that you talked about. The data breach in Equifax, I think, is also a substantial illustration that this kind of problem exists in a variety of formats and is potentially problematic. There's not really as much emotional appeal based on the risks here. In other words, I think you need to pull in the audience a little bit more as to what is the consequence to them. What do they have to fear? I mean, there's a slight element. Well, gee, that's not a good thing that people know those kinds of things. But if you had an example of some of the data breach having an impact on somebody's life, you mentioned, for instance, how somebody's financial data got screwed up or they got ripped off, or a sad story about somebody being misrepresented online because of this kind of data breach. I think that would be a little bit more involving and would add something to the presentation. I thought you had very good information about what the weaknesses in the existing protections are. You did a good job kind of diminishing those. When you compare the European Union's regulations, I think that you identify what it is that they do. What I'm wondering to know is how effective it is. Has it do they not have any data breaches? Do they respond to them faster? Is it something that, there's more, there's obviously some more consumer control because of the access point having to be, opting in and that sort of thing. But the question then becomes, so how do we know that this is working better? I know that what the rules are, and I know how they're different, and I can see how that might make a difference on some things, but I'm not sure how it makes a difference on all of the things that you're talking about. For example, the Equifax thing, I'm going, okay, well, how would this work in regard to, what we do? And I didn't really get much discussion of that, and I think that point needed to be developed a little bit more. But there's a lot of good information in the presentation. I thought you built a solid, neat argument here. The solution could use a little bit of workup, and like I said, maybe some more emotional investment in the subject. Presentation is, I think, very solid. You've got a good vocal presentation. You have to look down a little bit to look at your notes, but I thought you were doing a better job than you've done before, so maybe a smaller audience works better for you. All right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.